We would run into him when I was a kid. We lived out in Bellevue. And this is at the time that him and his son Eddie had their group together, Shaver, where Eddie, would play a 59 Strat through a, Marshall half stack dimed, turned with the cabinet facing the back of the room because everything was, it was just the entire amp was just on 10. Man, what a great player. Eddie was such a hoss, man. He was so good. But Billy Joe was living in an apartment in Bellevue at the time. I think a subdivision called, I think it's called Doral. It's like these little kind of townhouse type apartments out in Bellevue. And we lived out in Bellevue too when I was a kid, my mom and I. And we would run into him. It was either at the Miss Winners or the Lee's Chicken, which I don't even know if there is such a thing as Lee's Chicken anymore. I haven't seen one in years, but he would always be getting like chicken and biscuits, like in the mornings. We'd run into him there. And I didn't really know who he was. I was a kid. I was an elementary school age kid. And my mom would just say, he's a great writer. That guy's a really great writer. But I just remember how kind he was, for being, as I later learned, such like a badass, like actual outlaw, there was like this gentle kindness about him. I remember the first time I sort of met him as an adult, I was playing bass with Rosie Flores and we were opening for Shaver at the Exit Inn. And this would have been about this was the first time I spent any time talking to him, but I'd opened for him before with Greg Gehring, maybe a year or two earlier at 328. But I just remember he walked up to me after the sound check and put his hand out, with his nub fingers and said, "Hi, I'm Billy Joe. Thanks for playing on my show tonight." Or for playing at our show tonight, He didn't take ownership for the show, he was just so self-effacing and just this like meek kind of modesty about him that was just so genuine. And then he gets up on stage and tells stories about shooting off guns. And, I will say, I think anyone who ever saw Billy Joe Shaver can attest to this. I'm not a, very religious or like traditionally spiritual person, but I will say that the experience of seeing a Billy Joe Shaver show made you feel like you were in a church. There was he had that energy of like a preacher, and he could just lift the whole room up just by standing there and just singing his songs and telling his stories and just being himself. There was some kind of an energy there, an electricity with that guy that, and I was, raised around religion. So I know what that feels like, even though I don't really subscribe to it now, but I just remember only feeling that as an adult at a Billy Joe Shaver show. And it was every time I'd see him, like where you almost want to smile and cry at the same time. I don't know, man. They only made one of those,